President Donald Trump telling reporters today that his country doesn't need a free trade deal with Canada and Mexico.
I don't even think about USMCA. I mean, we don't need cars made in Canada. We don't need cars made in Mexico. We want to make them here.
On January 13th, Donald Trump stood in front of Ford plant workers and said something that instantly rippled across global markets. America doesn't need Canada. CUSMA? I don't care about it. It'll expire soon anyway. If you heard that line alone, you'd think Canada was finished. A 35% tariff threat, an all-out trade war, factories shutting down, an economy sliding straight into recession. But here's where the story takes a turn almost no one expected. In July 2025, data from the US Census Bureau and the Bank of Canada showed something shocking. Not 70%, not 80%. 90% of Canadian goods were still entering the United States tariff-free. And if you remove a few specific sectors like steel, aluminum, and autos, that number jumps even higher, around 94%. So let's pause for a second. Trump is publicly threatening massive tariffs. Markets are bracing for economic damage. And yet, almost everything Canada exports is still crossing the border untouched. That contradiction raises three questions that matter more than anything else. First, how is Canada keeping 90% of its exports tariff-free while Trump is openly escalating trade wars? Second, is Canada secretly paying a price that isn't showing up in headlines yet? And third, the most important one, is this even sustainable, especially with July 2026 approaching, when the entire CUSMA agreement faces review? To understand why 90% of Canadian exports are still protected, we first need to look at what Trump actually taxed. Trump's main weapon wasn't subtle. He invoked emergency powers. Under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, what he calls a national emergency tariff. It started at 25%, then jumped to 35% in August 2025. This tariff applies to all goods that do not comply with CUSMA. That's the key phrase. On top of that came the heavy hitters. Section 232 tariffs targeted steel and aluminum at 50%, no exceptions. Canada's metal sector was hit immediately. Auto tariffs came next, 25%. On the portion of a vehicle that isn't American-made. Energy and potash faced 10% tariffs. Softwood lumber took another hit. Plus anti-dumping duties scheduled to rise in 2026, potentially reaching 30 to 50% on furniture. If you stack all that together, Canada should have collapsed. But it didn't. So what's protecting that 90%? The answer sits inside a clause almost no one paid attention to when it was signed. Back in 2018, Trump proudly replaced NAFTA with a new deal, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement known as CUSMA. Inside that deal is a powerful rule, rules of origin. If a product meets those rules, it gets complete tariff exemption. 95%. No 35%. Zero. For most goods, this means 60 to 75% of the product must be sourced from North America. Autos face even stricter requirements. 75% regional content. 70% of steel and aluminum must come from North America. And a large portion must be produced in facilities paying at least $16 an hour. To claim the exemption, exporters need a certificate of origin. There's no single template, but every detail must be documented and provable. Here's the twist. Before Trump started threatening massive tariffs, businesses barely used this system. According to the WTO, in 2024, only 38% of Canadian exports to the US used CUSMA rules. Why so low? Because US tariffs were already tiny, averaging under 3%. Companies didn't want to deal with paperwork for marginal savings. That changed overnight. When Trump raised the threat to 35%, compliance stopped being optional. Either businesses adapted or they disappeared. Suddenly, exporters were scrambling to trace every component, rewrite contracts, and secure origin certificates. Within months, compliance jumped from 38% to around 90%. That's not generosity. That's survival. So now comes the obvious question. If Trump is so hostile toward Canada, why not just cancel CUSMA entirely? The answer isn't emotional. It's political and economic reality. Trump signed CUSMA himself. He sold it to American workers as the greatest trade deal ever made. Walking away from it would mean publicly admitting failure, something he's never been eager to do. But even more important than pride is dependency. North American supply chains are deeply intertwined. American factories rely on Canadian components. Ford, General Motors, Boeing's Seattle operations. Crushing Canadian exports wouldn't just hurt Canada, it would shut down US production lines. And then there's inflation. Trump already had to roll back tariffs on food products like beef and coffee in late 2025 after public backlash over rising prices. If Canadian goods were fully taxed, Americans would feel it immediately. Milk, meat, electricity, construction materials, lumber. Prices would spike and voters would notice. That's why the 90% exemption exists. Not because Trump is being kind, but because it's the least damaging option. But surviving isn't the same as winning. And that becomes clear when you look at the other 10%. That remaining 10% isn't random. It's concentrated in industries that matter most. Steel and aluminum face 50% tariffs with no relief. These sectors make up just over 4% of Canadian exports. But in provinces like Ontario and Quebec, they're pillar industries supporting tens of thousands of jobs. Autos make up another 4%. The problem isn't just the tariff rate, it's how it's applied. Only the US-made portion of a vehicle is exempt. On average, only 49% of a Canadian exported vehicle qualifies. That means over half the car gets taxed. Manufacturers are now forced to restructure supply chains, shifting sourcing away from Mexico and Asia toward the US. That takes time. It costs money. And it disrupts production. Then there's softwood lumber, a decades-long trade war that just got worse. Trump added new tariffs and anti-dumping, duties scheduled to escalate in 2026, potentially reaching 50% on furniture products. But tariffs aren't the most damaging cost. The real damage hides behind compliance. Getting a tariff exemption sounds simple. In reality, it's exhausting. Every shipment must be documented, every component traced, every supplier verified. Trade lawyers warn that compliance can range from manageable to extremely complex. Large corporations can absorb the cost. Small and medium-sized businesses can't. Some exporters are forced to choose between paying the tariff or exiting the U.S. market entirely. One business owner described it bluntly. You either adapt or you die. And beyond money, there's a deeper price being paid: strategic freedom. To stay compliant with CUSMA, Canadian products must stay North American. That limits Canada's ability to diversify trade with Asia or Europe. If Canada increases sourcing from China or Vietnam, those goods lose their exemption. Result? Canada is locked into what analysts call a golden cage: safe access to the US, but limited freedom to move elsewhere. And then there's the most dangerous clause of all, Article 3210, often called the poison pill. If Canada signs a free trade deal with a non-market economy, widely understood to mean China, the US can withdraw from CUSMA with just 6 months' notice. That makes every foreign policy move a risk calculation, which brings us to July 2026. CUSMA includes a mandatory 6-year review. The first one arrives in July 2026. There are only 3 outcomes. Best case, the deal is extended another 16 years. Worst case, the US withdraws entirely. Middle ground, no extension, no exit, just annual reviews until 2036, turning CUSMA into a zombie agreement. Meanwhile, US trade officials have already outlined demands. Open Canada's dairy market, dismantle supply management, roll back digital laws affecting Netflix and Google, resolve lumber subsidies, possibly split CUSMA into bilateral deals instead of a 3-country framework. These aren't tweaks. They're demands to reshape Canada's economic system. At the same time, the U.S. Supreme Court is reviewing the legality of Trump's emergency tariffs. An appeals court already ruled he may have abused emergency powers. If the court rules against him, the 35% tariff could vanish, but steel and aluminum tariffs would remain. And experts warn Trump won't stop. He'll find another legal path. Section 301, different authorities, different justifications. Meanwhile, Canada's Prime Minister traveled to China in mid-January. The first official visit since 2017, attempting to resolve trade disputes and regain leverage. It's a dangerous balancing act. Too close to China risks triggering the poison pill. Too distant leaves Canada with no leverage at all. So, is Canada winning, short term? Yes. The 90% exemption helped Canada avoid recession in 2025. It preserved 2.6 million jobs tied to U.S. trade. It protected 16% of GDP. But long term? Canada has lost strategic flexibility. Key industries are bleeding. Small businesses are being crushed by compliance, and the future remains unstable. The 90% exemption could disappear at any moment. July 2026 isn't the only danger, it's just the most visible one. Some analysts say CUSMA won't die, it'll linger. Alive enough to function, unstable enough to scare investment. So maybe the real answer isn't victory or defeat. It's delay. Canada isn't winning. It isn't losing. It's buying time. Negotiating. Balancing. Surviving day by day. July 2026 is where the real fight begins. So the question is yours. Will the 90% exemption survive? Can Canada escape Trump's shadow without losing CUSMA? Or is this just the calm before something far worse? If you made it this far, consider subscribing. It's how we keep uncovering what others won't say. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.